I'm going to be mixing up some glaze tests today, so I've got all my pots ready there and the recipe sheet. So I'm going to start by adding 75 ml of water into all of these pots before I add any ingredients. So once I've poured one with about 75 to 100 ml of water, I can then just use that as a reference and fill the other ones up to that level. Okay, the reason you put the water in first is when you put the dry powder ingredients in, the dry particles don't move into the air. Weighing the dry weights, I use a little digital scale like this with a pan on it. So if I turn that on like that, it's already set on grams. So if I put the tray on, so you could use a jug, you could use one of these little trays, and then if I press T, it'll just go back to naught, so it's taking into account the weight of the tray as well. And then I'm going to start weighing out my products. So you can see I've got my glaze mask on now to avoid inhaling any of the ceramic particles. I'll just show you what we're doing here. Okay, I might sound a bit muffled now because I've got my glaze mask on, but I've got the first ingredient, which is potash feldspar. I'm just going to make sure the scale is to 0, which it is. I've made this little scoop out of a bottle of juice, so you don't have to buy any fancy scoops. And I'm just going to weigh out, to start with, 34 grams of potash feldspar. So a little bit much there, so I'll just take a little bit out. Okay, there we go. Okay, so once you've weighed out that ingredient, then that can be put into the water. And then I'm going to do all the potash feldspar before I move on to the next ingredient. So when you look at your recipe, I'll just take my mask off. When you look at your recipe, you'll see that your recipe adds up to basically 100 grams, and then additions of oxides after that. So if you could make a bigger test, you could just double the ingredients or times it by 10. Once you're happy with your results, you could make a whole bucket full. So I'm just going to go through all the ingredients step by step, adding them, and then I'll show you how I then go and sieve the glaze. So after you've added all the ingredients in, it's a good idea just to let that slake in the water for a bit before you mix anything else, any oxide or anything else into there. And just make sure that you just keep continually wiping where you've been working so you're not getting any airborne dust. Okay, so I've got 2 grams of rutile there. You can see it's quite a small quantity, so that's why it's quite handy to have some electronic scales like this. And you may use something like rutile. I've got nickel oxide there, I've got cobalt oxide, I have tin oxide, and they're relatively small quantities you're adding now. So I've numbered all the pots, so once I've added those ingredients, I shall write onto my base glaze what I've added into that particular pot. So then when I put it onto a test towel, I can look at what that recipe was later on. So with the smaller ingredients, sometimes you need sort of a 0.1 or a 0.5. So I've measured 0.5 grams of cobalt out onto a piece of paper. It's really tricky to weigh any less than that unless you've got the really micro scales. And then what I will do is divide that up into 5 so that I know that that's 0.1 grams when I'm adding it into my glaze. So once all your ingredients are into your little pots, then you can give them a good stir up. Because they've been sat in the water for a relatively long time, they should be pretty easy to stir up. And then you're going to sieve through an 80 mesh sieve. You can use 80 or 100. And I usually sieve it a couple of times through the sieve and then pour it back into the container before I do my test tile.